Welcome to Noon Hour Slides from the Moose Jaw Museum and Art Gallery. We're located on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Blackfoot, Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We pay our respects to First Nations and Métis ancestors and reaffirm our relationship with one another. We gratefully acknowledge funding from the City of Moose Jaw, Sask Arts, Sask Culture, Saskatchewan Lotteries, Canada Council for the Arts, Canadian Heritage, and the Government of Canada. I'm Vincent Hotelling, the Administrative Assistant here, and I'm here to welcome you to today's presentation. Rod Stutt is here to talk to us about Scotland. Welcome.
So this is the Royal Arms of Scotland. It's known as the Lion Rampant, and it's one of three symbols, at least one being the Saltire Cross and the other the Thistle. And I'm just using it sort of as a test pattern here to get started. So what we're going to talk about is a trip we took to Scotland. We essentially went around the whole country. We started in Edinburgh, worked our way up through the lowlands here, visited some places in Aberdeen County, saw some things in the eastern highlands near Inverness, went over to the Isle of Skye, and the Western Highlands, places such as Stirling, and ended the trip in Glasgow. Edinburgh is the capital, Glasgow is the largest city. This is a view of Edinburgh. We're at Edinburgh Castle, which is on a very high hill right in the middle of the city. And we're looking over the Prince Street Gardens, which is originally was a large lake that was used as a moat for the castle. And then the so-called New Town, which was built in the late 17 and early 1800s at a time when Scotland, and especially Edinburgh, was extremely prosperous, and an era known as the Scottish Enlightenment. And so there are a lot of very nice, substantial buildings. It's a planned community. And that's the Firth of Forth that we see in the distance. Here's a closer look at some of the types of buildings that you see in the New Town. And you can see just beyond the New Town, just to the north, is a large green area. That's a park and where the Royal Botanical Gardens are located. And they were founded as a scientific enterprise back in the 1600s. And they have grown to be one of the largest gardens, both from a tourist point of view and from a research perspective. This hill is known as Calton Hill. And you can see several prominent buildings. One at the left, the tall tower, is the Walter Scott Memorial. You have also a memorial to Admiral Nelson, and you have a so-called National Monument of Scotland, which is an incomplete replica of the Parthenon. Again, during the Scottish Enlightenment, they looked at the Parthenon as an example of learning and of scholarship. And so that they were going to build a replica. They ran out of money in the 1820s and haven't done anything since. So it's kind of an unusual type of semi-ruin. The Scottish government buildings are down to the lower right below that hill, and also just to the right, but back up on the level of where we are, is the Royal Palace, Holyrood. Here's a close-up of some of the buildings on the hill. You can see the Nelson Memorial on the left. And other prominent buildings, you can see the quality of construction that they had at that time in the 1800s. When Edinburgh was really the center of British scholarship. And as we well know, the Scots were very prominent in founding Canada. There was a lot of wealth coming back from the fur trade to Edinburgh as well. Some other buildings dating from that era. And of course, there are some more modern things and things that are a little less regal. Here's an example of a food store where you can buy all sorts of Scottish treats. This is another Scottish souvenir store, and something of more interest to the people who actually lived there. Here's some of the scenes from the botanical gardens that are just to the north of the new town, and it is one of the largest and most interesting botanical gardens in Britain, probably second only to Kew Gardens in London. A great variety of tropical plants, as you can see. It is a Royal Botanical Gardens, and there are a variety of places, this one in memory of the Queen Mother, pointing out that the Queen of England and Canada is also the Queen of Scotland. And of course, they have a much milder and more moist climate than what we're familiar with here. So even outdoors, they have a great variety of plants that we wouldn't be aware of here. And they're very well maintained. This is Princes Street Park, another large open space, which I mentioned before, used to be filled with water until they drained it in the 1800s. And you can see at the higher building, the Old Town at the left, and the lower New Town is to the right. And we're looking up towards the older part of the city. The Scott Monument. And looking again through some of the relatively fancy monuments, this one to Livingston, that they built in the park in Princes Street Park. And looking up towards the Edinburgh Castle, which is a real military castle. The land was occupied from prehistoric times, and smaller castles have existed there since before the year 1000. And this one in particular dates from somewhere in the 1600s. And you climb up to the upper town to the location of Edinburgh Castle. Earliest significant thing that took place here is this was the home of Queen Margaret of Scotland, who died in 1093, and she later became a saint and the patron saint of Scotland. James VI of Scotland, who was King James of England, the one from the famous King James Bible, was born in this castle as well. So it's seen a lot of very important history. I mentioned this earlier, the lion rampant, and one of the tour guides was pleased enough to pose for us, inviting us into the inner part of the Edinburgh Castle. You can see the lion rampant over the door at the back as well. Some examples of castle construction and the cannons. As I say, it was a working military base and is still the home to the Royal Scots Dragoons. And at the top, it's actually fairly open. There's a large open space between a lot of buildings, and this would be where some very important military things, such as the annual tattoo, would take place at the height of the castle and just in front of it. And this is the building, which is the museum of the Royal Scots Dragoons, and there also the National War Museum is up here. And here's some examples of the, remembering that this was a royal castle, and then of course officers of the Queen's Army, and so it's very, very elaborately furnished. The stained glass, including the emblem of, in this case, the United Kingdom. So you see not only the Scots, Irish, and British symbols there, and the fleur-de-lis from France. Some of the Scottish traditional medieval military weapons, and also honors and awards that the regiment would have received over the centuries. We're still looking at some of the more prominent buildings in the Old Town now, and you can see that it is more medieval looking. It's fewer broad streets and big parks. There is one prominent open space, and this is the graveyard of Greyfriars Church. Now, of course, as in England, the Roman Catholic Church ceased to exist for a period of time during the time of Henry VIII, and this became a secular graveyard. And one of the people buried there is famous less because of anything he did, but more because of his dog. The dog's name was Bobby, and when his master died in 1858, the dog loyally tended his grave and guarded it for 14 years and became essentially a local pet of the city. And this has been commemorated over the years. There you can see, obviously, there is a bar. Also, a very prominent Walt Disney movie was made in the early 60s. And there is a statue of Bobby, which is in the Old Town part of Edinburgh. While we're in the Old Town, of course, we had to stop at a Scottish pub. And one of the things I want to draw your attention to is we are passionate about real ales. It's very important. There's a lot of internationalization of bottled and canned beer, and there's a big movement in Britain to remember the local stuff. And pubs prominently display whether that they are a real ale pub, which is, of course, the ones that I would prefer to go to. So now we're going north from Edinburgh. We're looking at the typical lowlands of Scotland, very gentle fields that have been farmed for centuries. And one of the things, if you want to go back centuries, there's how are these stone monuments. And you may think that these are prehistoric and go back thousands of years. They are Pictish. And the Picts were a tribe in Scotland, and they were prominent between 6th and 9th centuries. They were, in fact, Christianized. And they were the prominent tribe in Eastern Scotland at the time that the Celts were prominent in Western Scotland. And they made a lot of these memorials using old traditions that look prehistoric, but if you look at some of the carvings on these things, you will see that there are actually Christian symbols. This is in a place called Aberlemno, which is a farm area. There are 5 sites where these various standing stones are in that vicinity, and they're right beside the road, and some are in the middle of farmers' fields. This is Aberlemno site number 1, and this one is site number 3. And as you can see, this one does have a Christian cross carved on it. This is the town of Magel, and in the old church of Magel, they have made a museum with a lot of these early Pictish stones. What we're looking at here is known as Magel number 26, and you can see there are 4 people who are interlaced in the sense of a Celtic knot, a very traditional type of symbol in Scotland. Magel number 5, you can actually see the label here. You can see the cross and the carvings of various symbolic animals. They're very high quality of carving that they did in this era. And this has been researched. There are a total of 27 stones on display in the Magel Church. Still in the lowlands, working our way up the North Sea, this is Dunatar Castle, and it's a castle that was originally built in the 5th century. And one of its claims to fame is when the English and the Scots were fighting in the Scottish Wars of Independence, the crown jewels of Scotland were spirited away from Edinburgh and hidden in Dunatar Castle to prevent them from being captured. It's a really dramatic site. You can see, obviously, it would be dramatic even without the ruins of the castle. The castle was built in the 15th century. And it's on an island that you cross a little bridge that's over a very narrow channel, and then on top of the island is the castle grounds. Some of these buildings are interesting for the construction, and some places it's more interesting because of the demolition. It just leaves very interesting pieces of the building to explore and to look at, and to see the kind of construction that they had in those days with knights and castles. So it's either a very romantic or a very spooky place. Here we are at Crothis Castle, which is in the northeast of the Aberdeenshire. It's a, guys, we're almost approaching the Highlands. And this castle is a 16th century castle, and it's most famous for its 4-acre walled garden that dates from 1702. And again, with the mild climate, this is just an amazingly lush place, and you could spend hours exploring it. Really, really nice place to visit. And this was, of course, a Scottish baron, and it's a part of the aristocracy. And therefore, this was extremely well financed and well developed. And now it's nice that it's open to the public. So well worth a visit. Antiques Roadshow, by the way, used this as a location for one of their broadcasts. Here we're getting to the Highlands, and you can see that the terrain is a lot rougher and a little more wild and a little more hilly, and there's various things like thistles and so on that are growing here. Scottish symbol. And as we get into the Highlands, we get to Culloden, which is a site of a very famous battle. The Battle of Culloden was the last battle of the independent Scots against the English. It took place between the son of James Stuart, who was known as Charles Edward Stuart, and the son of King George II, who was known as the Duke of Cumberland. And so this dates from the 1746, the last of the Jacobite uprising, as it was sometimes called. And of course, one of the last battles on English soil, and one of the last ones where members of the royal family actually led their troops on horseback. The site is very, very well preserved in terms of the archaeology. Obviously, there was just a field at the time of the battle, and it remains a field. But one of the things they do is they have these trails, as you can see, and you have earphones, and there are low power radio transmitters scattered around the various places, so that as you move, you are told the story of, which troops were located where, which direction the lines were, what type of action they saw at which point in the battle. So as you walk around the battlefield, you can imagine where everybody was and how the battle took place. That cairn in the middle is a monument to the people who died in the defense of Scottish freedom and fighting for Prince Charlie. It is to be noted, actually, that this was a civil war between as much Scots and the English as it was between Catholics and Protestants. Prince Charlie was, in fact, the former English Prince of Wales. And because he was Catholic, he was passed over for succession when Queen Anne died. And many Catholics thought that that was unfair. And of course, the Scots were very upset that a German king was put on the throne in place of one from the United Kingdom. And there were actually, therefore, Scottish people fighting on both sides, depending on where they lined up in terms of the dispute between the Catholics and the Protestants. But it is depicted today in Scottish history as a fight between Scots and the English. This was a very, very brutal battle, and you can't tell that here, but the English wanted to make sure they literally took no prisoners. 2,000 people died in a 1-hour skirmish. They wanted to send a message that would prevent any further uprisings, and this is therefore remembered with very bitter memory in Scottish history. So it's a very important site to visit. Here's an old farmhouse, a croft, that is on display that you can look at while you're there. Thatched roof and field stone and so forth in terms of the construction. Very close to Culloden is this site, which is an important prehistoric site. It's known as Clavas Cairns. There are 3 burial cairns here that must have been obviously very important people. And then around there are various standing stones that are believed to have astronomical significance. We have moved away from the Pictish area. This is the Celtic region of Scotland. And these cairns look very reminiscent of similar constructions around in Ireland, and they date from about 2000 BC, 4,000 years ago. So that these were being constructed at the same time as some of the Egyptian pyramids. The type of construction is actually very sophisticated, because they actually had domed vaults, which is obviously something that most people couldn't do in 2000 BC. And so there are as I say, there's more than one cairn, and then there are these standing stones. One of the things that always appeals to me, speaking of stones, are the old Victorian era railway trestles. This is one of the cairns, and we can see the scale of this. And at the time it was built, that would have been a complete dome over the top of the burial chamber. There's our railway trestle. This is Elgin Cathedral. Elgin Cathedral was built in 1224, and then it was abandoned. And then it collapsed in 1637. So that what it is a ruins of a cathedral, which again is a very interesting place, because it's almost sculptural and less of an enclosed room. And it's just interesting to wander around. The graves that were on the floor of the cathedral, as you can see, are still there. And you can see exposed structure and also some aesthetic elements like carved statues. And the other thing, as you can see from the camera angle of this picture, they let you climb up to the top of some of the remaining pieces of the building. And it's fun to clamber around. This is the only part that remains intact. Gothic arch. You can see the rose window. That's view from a tower. Gothic vaulting that's still intact. Cross section of a rubble wall, and here's some of the carving that remains from that era. A lot of Scotland is ruins, whether it's ruined castles or ruined cathedrals or battlefields on which the soldiers met their demise. Modern Scotland is a very modern place, and very wealthy in certain areas with the computer industry and other new things happening. This is one of the streets of Inverness, just a wonderful place to wander around. We had a bed and breakfast there. And of course, we made sure we had time for a Scotch tasting. This is our friend Bob on the left, who from Kentucky and only drank bourbon, so I had to make a point of introducing him to the finer whiskeys of the world. And then that young lady on the right, I presume, is Scottish. And Loch Ness, which is famous for the monster that may or may not exist, but it's a beautiful part of the Highlands. And we find on Loch Ness the ruins of Urquhart Castle, the Urquharts being a prominent Scottish family in the region, and of course an important family here in Moose Jaw as well. Urquhart Castle is built in about the 1500s, and again, it was met its demise, in this case very deliberately. The English army coming from the south occupied the castle in order to try to control the Scottish tribes to the north. And when the English abandoned this fortress, they blew it up in order to make sure that the Scots couldn't use it as part of a counterattack. So unfortunately, what is a very large and very beautiful castle in a very beautiful location on Loch Ness is again now a beautiful ruin. Wonderful to walk around, take a picnic and spend a day here. And again, you can climb, as you can see, up to the top and get views of the lake and up and down the valley. They do have a museum display, and they even talk about whether or not the monster is real. Spoiler alert, they don't reach a conclusion, but they do talk about various efforts that were made using radar and sonar and various other techniques to try to see if there was a monster in the lake. The Ness is a river. Inverness is where the river flows into Loch Ness. And of course, the monster's name is Nessie. So we leave this and continue going west. We're now going overland to the Isle of Skye. You can see again some of the typical highland type plants, and the more rugged mountains of the highlands that are very different than what we saw in Aberdeen. This is Eileen Donan Castle, which dates from the 13th century. It too was destroyed or fell apart and was rebuilt about 100 years ago. So very dramatic scenery as we get now to the west coast, the Atlantic Ocean side. This is our friend Joe. He's trying to set his GPS, but apparently there are no towns with coordinates because it's almost uninhabited on the Isle of Skye. But we didn't have much trouble because there's also only one road. It just goes around the perimeter and comes back the other side. Beautiful, beautiful place. It's the largest of the Hebrides Islands and the closest to the mainland. Remembering that we are driving on the left side of the road in Britain. Takes about 3 or 4 hours to drive around if you don't stop, longer if you do. But great variety of scenery as well, very dramatic. These are basalt cliffs. You can see pieces that have broken off in the ocean. And various Scottish plants like heather and road gets even narrow. And apparently it's out of cell phone range. So they actually have right there in the middle of nowhere a local phone booth. Here is a old settlement. You can see the graveyard of the family, and the farmhouse is preserved. So you can visit. There are more cows than people there. So here, and you can go into here, and it's a reconstruction of what a farm would have been like in the 1800s. This is the most important part of the tour of the Isle of Skye, which is, of course, the Talisker Distillery, which has been there since 1836. And they have a tasting room, and there's also a tour where you learn about how the Scotch whiskey is made. Basically, what you do is you take malted barley and you ferment it as you would in a beer, but unlike beer, you don't put the hops in it. What you do is then put it through a second stage of distillation in order to create the whiskey and some of their best products on sale. Going from the Isle of Skye, we're going through the Glen Coe, which is again, very, very high dramatic hills from the highlands. And this is the site of another major battle known as the Glen Coe Massacre, where two different Scottish families were feuding, and one killed dozens of the others. And this was in 1692. And so that it's a place that led to a lot of feuds that continued from the years since then. But beautiful scenery, wildlife that you might find. This is a model of Stirling Castle. If there is one sort of small, compact part, if you see only one place in Scotland, Stirling might be the place. It is an intact castle, unlike many of the others. It dates from the 9th century. It's the childhood home of Mary, Queen of Scots, and also James VI of Scotland, who was James I of England. It is the current home of the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. And as you might imagine, it's the site of many famous battles. Just one thing about Mary, Queen of Scots, as we tour this castle. One of the reasons that she was holed up in here and in Edinburgh Castle was the forces of the British Queen Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII, were fighting literally and over a succession of the throne between the rivals Stuarts and the Tudors, two rival royal families in England. The way it turned out is that Elizabeth prevailed on the battlefield, but Elizabeth had no children, and therefore the current royal family, including present Queen Elizabeth, are in fact descended from Queen Mary, Queen of Scots. This is a recreation, or rather a restoration of the interior of the royal palace as it might have looked in the 1500s. These tapestries are actually a recreation. They've been made by hand in order to match the ones that existed originally. So these are only a few decades old. But nonetheless, it's a very beautiful tapestry and a very good example of the high quality of medieval art. Some other examples of Stirling. It was a real fortress right up until recent years. As I say, it's still occupied by the Highlanders. Here is a statue of Robert the Bruce. And unlike Culloden, there are some very famous battles that were won by the Scots. And this Robert Bruce led his army to victory at the Battle of Bannockburn, which took place very close to this castle in 1314. Out in the mist, and it's not our camera, it's that Scotland has a lot of Scots mist. Out in the mist, you can see a hill, and on that hill is a tall tower, which is a memorial to William Wallace, There is a close-up of the Robert Bruce Memorial. And the William Wallace Memorial is right dead center in the top of that picture. You can see through the mist. William Wallace won the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297 and is therefore also a revered hero among the Scots. And town of Stirling, again, a quaint, almost medieval town, so that if you visit one place, the town of Stirling will give you a sense of what those towns are like. This looks like it could be some sort of prehistoric earthworks. It actually dates fairly recently. It's from the coronation of King Charles I. And they built these as part of the, for the ceremonies to take place. And some pictures in Stirling. We've now moved on to a bigger city. This is Glasgow. And what you can see here are some of the prominent buildings on their main street, which date again from the Victorian era. Glasgow is an industrial city, unlike Edinburgh, which was the capital and a university city. And it meant that it had a lot of slums and people who worked in the shipyards and so on, very tough neighborhoods. But it also meant that the people who owned all of those industries and the places where they shopped downtown had some very, very elegant buildings. And some of these still remain. One of the more quainter parts of Glasgow, again, some of the element housing that would have been built in the late 1800s. One of the places we visited, this is at the east side near Strathclyde University, is Glasgow Cathedral, which you can see here. In England, most of the Roman Catholic cathedrals at the time, Henry VIII, were taken over by the Church of England, which is the Anglican Church. In Scotland, the cathedrals were taken over by the Church of Scotland. So this is a Presbyterian church. Moving to the west side of downtown, there's a large park. It's where the Kelvin River flows through a small woods, and the park is known as Kelvin Grove. And there are a variety of monuments in it. This particular one is for the Boer War. And what we can see here is the bridge that was built in 1891. And it was in the kind of steel from the industrial era, that when the industry, the shipbuilding industry in Glasgow was at its peak. This is near Glasgow University. In the background there, you can see a museum that we're going to get a closer look at. The Kelvin River. That is Glasgow University beyond the plants there. This is Lord Kelvin. His real name was William Thompson, and he was made Lord of this region, which was named for the river. He is very famous because of the fact that the Kelvin temperature scale is named after him. He was an important researcher in the 1800s. And so that there's a monument to him here as well. And this is the Kelvin Grove Museum. It's a Victorian era museum. And it's one of the largest museums, and it's got a great variety of a typical Victorian museum that has a little bit of everything. And as again in a Victorian museum, the building is almost as exciting as the stuff that is inside. Here is a commissioned art exhibit. It's known as Floating Heads. It was done in 2006. The artist is Sophie Cave. So just something to catch one's attention. Now you can see some of the examples of the taxidermied African animals during the Victorian era, before television and so on. people would see these things only in museums and they would marvel at them. And so this is a little bit of a throwback to a Victorian era museum display. The airplane you see there is a Spitfire, very famous World War II plane that was the workhorse of the Royal Air Force. And of course, like all art museums, there are some examples of actual art, like paintings. And what we see here is stuff that you would be unlikely to see in a museum in London, and certainly you wouldn't learn much about these people if you were looking at a museum on this continent. Here's an example of the Scottish colorists, so their equivalent of the Regina Five, four local people who were influenced by Impressionism and did a variety of work locally in Scotland, and are known throughout Scotland and to a lesser extent in England. One of the larger exhibits is exhibits of furniture and interior design. This is Charles René Mackintosh, who's said to be the greatest Scottish architect, and his wife, Margaret MacDonald, had a design practice in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It was said to be the Scottish modernist movement, which is their equivalent of the French Art Nouveau. And they designed everything from the flatware and dishes to the chairs, to the walls, to the windows, to the exteriors of the buildings. And there's a very large exhibit of Mackintosh furniture and other furniture from that era, and the cutlery and so on. Here's a recreation of a restaurant that Mackintosh designed, very cleverly mixing the photograph with some real pieces. This is one of Margaret's paintings, again in an Art Nouveau style. And this is similar stuff by another artist, but of that same era, of that Scottish modern movement. And you can buy souvenirs. Also, the Willow Tea Rooms, which were designed by Mackintosh, still exist. You can actually go and order lunch there. And the whole interior space, as well as a lot of the plates and so on, are original Mackintosh. It's one of the few Mackintosh spaces that still remains. This is the Glasgow College of Art. Now, Charles Mackintosh and Margaret MacDonald met as art students there in 1892. They married in 1900. And in 1909, he got the commission to design the school building. And so this is known as the Mackintosh Building, one of the more prominent buildings of one of what claims to be one of the top 8 art schools in Europe. And it is done in this Scottish modern or Art Nouveau style. Unfortunately, this building has had not one, but 2 devastating fires. And they are now doing fundraising. Here you can see an architectural model of the building. To reconstruct it as it originally was built. So if you're keen, you can send them some money. And I'm going to end on Scottish money. Scotland sees itself as a separate country, equal partner to England in the United Kingdom. And when I first went to Scotland, I was quite surprised to see they even had their own currency. That is legal tender. I've even been able to spend Scottish money in London.